Okay, here's the scenario. Go home from conference, go into the office on Friday. Your boss comes to you in a panic. He tells you that the Tableau server admin was screwing around during conference, accidentally deleted every single user from your Tableau server instance. On top of that, due to some undisclosed overindulgence at the Tableau data night out, he won't be making it into the office today. And your boss needs you to make sure all the users, hundreds of them, are back in Tableau server. Pop quiz, hotshot, what do you do? Well, here's one option. Open up Tableau server, log in, click on users, click add user, start typing in their names and email addresses one by one. Hey honey, not gonna make it home for dinner tonight. My boss has me entering names one by one into a box on Tableau server. So that's one option. Whoops. Here's the other option. Open up my command line, type python add users.py, and hit enter. Then I sit back, kick my feet up, complain to my boss about all the work I have to do today, and then go home at noon. And the best part of all of this is that add users.py script, 12 lines of code. That's just one example of using the Tableau REST API to automate the sometimes tedious or manual steps that are required for managing Tableau server. Now, my goal in this session is to help you understand what the REST API is for, give you some common use cases, and to also get you started in learning how to use the REST API yourself. Well, before we do that, it's always important, especially in these developer types of talks, to make sure the right people are in the room. I'm not saying you have to be a full-time developer, but you probably have some questions about the REST API. So you might be asking yourself, oh, what is this REST API? I've heard it. Is it something that could be useful for our organization? And then you might have someone else write the code, but at least you've learned what it's for and the types of things it can do. You might actually be that developer who's going to create those REST API scripts. In which case, my goal, again, is to show you where to get started, show you some of the logic behind Tableau's REST API so you can go home and skip those first steps in learning the basics. And again, if you just want to see some cool use cases, I hope to show you some of those too. And finally, there are little tidbits where I'm using some alpha code for future versions of the REST API. So I'll talk just a little bit about some types of things we're adding to the REST API coming up. Now, the first question is, what do we use this for? What can it do? And if you go look at the documentation, you can look up every little thing you can do. That might not really help you understand exactly what it's for. So I like to break it down into two common use cases, types of companies or situations people use the REST API for. And the first is automation. You saw that already. I have a list of users, I'm going to automatically provision them. And maybe I want to grab all of a bunch of workbooks, publish those too while I'm at it, and make sure the right people have access to the right workbooks, etc. It's useful in enterprise settings where you have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of users in your Tableau server. Also in that kind of large deployment enterprise scenario, which doesn't necessarily have to be the case of a large company, but a large complicated deployment of Tableau, you might need to know information about your content. Who has been publishing all of these workbooks? This user, which ones did they publish? I'm about to modify a data source. Which workbooks use that data source? And so that kind of auditing of my Tableau server for my specific use case can be done with the REST API. Also, integration with other applications. Most common integration of Tableau is taking dashboards, inserting them into another web application. And you can do that. That has nothing to do with the REST API. But as soon as you do that, now you have all kinds of other issues. How do you manage the individual workbooks permissions for the individual users? Someone new signs up for my web application. Do they have to wait for me to manually add them as a user before they can use the content, the embedded Tableau content in my web application? No, of course not. You use the REST API to automatically create them as a user. Another type of third-party integration that might utilize the REST API is something where maybe you have an application or some scripts that modify data, grab data from a bunch of different resources using Python or something like that. And at the end, you want to create a data source, publish it to Tableau server, and give permissions to the right people. Okay, so a quick primer. I just had an argument out in the hall right before this on whether it's primer or primer, but we won't get into that. What exactly is REST? Okay, we probably have a wide variety of software engineering expertise in the room, so we will just go through this quickly. Put simply, REST is a protocol for web-based communication. I send an HTTP request to an application, and I get responses back. And they're organized in a RESTful manner, whatever that means. You don't need to know that. An implication of that is that you can essentially use any programming language. You might be a Python developer. You might be a JavaScript developer. Your application might be written in Java or .NET. Or you might be one of these hipster programmers using Golang and stuff like that. Doesn't matter. You can essentially use any programming language that can make web requests, which is essentially all of them. Now let's talk a little bit about the anatomy, what is required in an individual request to the API before we actually show you some of these individual requests. This comes from the REST protocol. First thing you need is a noun. What are you doing this to? Are you doing this to a specific user? Are you doing this to all of the workbooks? Are you doing this to a specific site? Every kind of object on Tableau server has a unique URI, and that's the noun of a request. So you want to do something to a user. What do you want to do to them? Do you want to get information about them? That's a GET request. Do you want to delete them? That's a delete request. Do you want to update information about them? That's a put request. Or do you want to create a new user altogether? That's a post request. So these are HTTP verbs that define on that specific object, what am I doing to it? And finally, you need an XML payload that specifies the details of what you're trying to accomplish. This isn't true for GET, you're just querying. But if I'm updating user or creating a new user, we need information about that user. What's their name? What's their email address? Do you want them to be an interactor or an admin, etc.? Same thing with workbooks. That XML payload is where you'll specify that. Okay, so enough high level. Let's go all the way deep in and handcraft some of these requests. So here I am back in my terminal. And if you haven't heard of curl, it's essentially a command line utility for making HTTP requests. So I can do something like curl google.com, and I get back a bunch of HTML and JavaScript, because that's what happens when I make a GET request to google.com. So what we'll do over the next few minutes is we'll actually build some of these requests using curl. It's not a programming language. You wouldn't actually do this in your production code, but it helps show you the individual pieces of a workflow. And I bet I have, this is all dirty from last session, so sorry about that. Let me undo a lot of this. All right. So I have a few curl requests that we'll make. The first thing you have to do in any REST API script is to sign in. Any REST API workflow, you must sign in. So we know that you're an admin, so you can do the correct things. You don't have to be an admin, but you can only do the things you're allowed to do. So to sign in, you make a post request. This -x parameter is the verb. You make a -post request to the URL of your server /API /2.3/auth/signin. The -d parameter is your payload, and here we just manually we're creating the XML payload in a string. Every request payload to the XML starts with TS request, and then there's details inside. The sign-in post must include your credentials, of course, because that you're signing in. So there's an element called credentials, and inside of it I have my username and password. I always must sign in to an individual site. Just like in Tableau Server, you can't do things across sites all at once. There's very few things you can do. And that's the same thing for the REST API. Now, in this case, I'm going to sign in to the default site. And I can do that just by passing in, for the content URL, an empty string. Now, what exactly does content URL mean? If you go to any site in Tableau Server, in fact, we might as well show that. Here I am in the default site. There's no site specified, and that's why we use the content URL of empty string. If I go to Coke, here I have, I don't know if I can zoom in on that. I have the name of the site, and it's Coke. So that's what we mean by the content URL. Again, in this case, I'm just signing into the default site, which is I can specify with an empty string. So I'll take that request, copy it, head back over to my terminal, paste it in, and I get a response. It's a little hard to see here in terminal, so I'll go ahead and copy paste it back into my text editor. There's a bunch of stuff about what version of the API and that kind of thing. But most importantly is this part of the response. First thing we get is our credentials token. We need to include this in the header of every further request we make to the API because that's how we specify we signed in. Then we have our site element. Now here's our old friend content URL. That's the default site. But moving forward, we're going to have to specify the site ID. Before I actually use this, it's important to take a step back and talk about IDs in the REST API. If I want to update a user, I can't say update user Jane. I have to say update user with the ID of this long string, which is known as a LUID or LUID. And that's the nature of utilizing the API. So you'll notice we'll get into this and we'll kind of be juggling these IDs. Okay, I want to give permissions to this user. Well, first of all, what's their ID? Query Jane for their ID. Now I have their ID, and now I can move forward. You can see here I'm automatically given my user ID in case I need to use it, modify myself, or something like that. Okay, so we're signed in. Now let's make our first actual request. One of the most common things, and probably the easiest thing to do with the REST API, is to get all of the users, query all of the users on our site. So here's our noun. It's a long URI. After API/2.3 is where you're kind of specifying the tree of the object you're trying to get to. So sites/site ID. Pretty much always include this. So let's go ahead and grab our site ID that we grabbed up above and paste it into the URI. sites, start at the high level, sites/site ID, then go down to the users level. That's where we want to do, that's the noun, all users. What are we doing to all of the users? We're just querying them, so that's a GET request. And finally, you have to include the header, as I talked about, the X Tableau auth, which is your auth token that the sign-in request returned. Copy that, paste it in, and now we're ready to make this GET request to get all the users. Copy it, paste it into terminal. Oops. Remove that. Oops. Remove the endline character, and now I'll copy it, paste it in. And here's all my users. I just added 200 users, as you guys saw, so there's a lot of users in here. But I'll just grab one of these user objects, copy it, and show you what it looks like. So inside of TS response XML, we have a users element, and inside of the users element, we have a bunch of user elements. Those are all of the information about our users. And now we can grab their individual IDs and do something to them. You also notice other information about them, their site role, their emails. Sorry, I forgot to say this. Do you mind if I hold questions at the end, especially a conversation like this? Yeah. Okay. So we now know information about Isabel. Maybe we want to change something. We don't have her email in here. Let's give her an email address. Modifying a person or anything is a put request. Of course, we always have to start with our noun, which is /sites/site ID. /users, that's where we stopped last time because we were querying all the users. This time we're doing something to an individual user. Go one step further into /users/user ID, which we just grabbed up above for user named Isabel. There's our put request. There's our header for our auth token. And finally, we need an XML payload. We didn't have to do that for GET because we weren't changing anything. We're just querying it all. This time, we're actually changing something. This is where we specify what we're changing about Isabel. Now, as always, you have TS requests, and then inside of it, you want to insert a user object. So luckily, I have this one I just grabbed. I'll just grab that. I don't want to change her ID or her name or her site role. So I'll delete all those, and I will just say email equals Isabel. Is it one S? Isabel at tc16.com. Grab that user object, throw it into the TS request, grab that full curl request, and post it in. And then it returns the user element again, and you can see this time it has her email address in it. So of course, as I said, you're never going to sit there and do that. If you had to do that 200 times, of course, that'd be way harder than going into Tableau Server and manually doing it that way. It's just a good way to learn the individual parts of the REST API. But really what you're going to do is you're going to write some code to utilize the REST API. So here's a new scenario. I have, inside of my default project, a variety of workbooks, and some of these I've specified with the tag download. So I can search for download, and you can see that these 3 workbooks have the tag download. What I'd like to happen is I'd like to get a PDF report in my inbox every Monday with the images of the views of these workbooks. So throughout the week, I can say, no, now I don't want to download that one, now I want to download that one, and I want the script to just run every Monday and give me that PDF report. Now we know we can download individual workbooks or CSVs or individual PDFs. We know we can subscribe to an individual workbook to be in our inbox. But there's no built-in way to kind of handcraft a single PDF with all the reports that are interesting to me. So we use the REST API to accomplish that. In this case, it's actually a JavaScript script using Node.js, trying to get the point across that it's not just Python, it's not just Java, it's not just any language. So you'll see JavaScript here today and you'll see Python. But whatever your favorite scripting or programming language, you can use it. So I'll fire up this Node application, grabimages.js. Go to my Finder. And now I have a new PDF report where it grabbed all of the images for all of the views in that workbook and published them in a PDF report for me. So it's kind of one ask, right? You could put it in one sentence. Put all of the images from that have the tag download into a PDF. Using the REST API, as we just saw, to modify a single user took 3 requests. And it's the same kind of idea if we're going to create a script like this. Let's take a look at that grabimages.js file. As I said, this is a Node.js, which is server-side JavaScript. If you're not a huge JavaScript person, it's no big deal. Hopefully, I'll point out the key parts that hint at how you use the JavaScript API. So here at the top, we have load all of our correct modules, define what server we're logging into, etc. The first step, just as in the curl workflow, is always to sign in. When we signed in with curl, we built a request that looked something like this, an XML request. We're not going to hard code that in. We're going to use JavaScript. You'd probably do this in any programming language to create that XML payload for us. So Node has this idea of, forget the name of the module, it's XML writer. And allows us to say start element, TS request. Inside of that element, create a new element called credentials. Inside of credentials, we need 2 attributes, my name and my password. And we also need another element inside of credentials, which is which site am I logging into, along with the actual name of that site in the content URL. It's a lot easier to use than writing all those brackets, making sure that you have the correct nested XML, etc. There's our XML payload. We know we wanted to post to sign in, which is server URL / API / the version of the API / auth / sign in. The body or the payload is the XML we just created. The headers, we don't have it just text.xml. Later we'll use the auth token in every header moving forward. Okay, so we make the post request here. When that is done, this code will execute, all of this code. And so let's go through that. The response, the TS response, the response from Tableau server to that request will come in this body object, this body argument. That essentially will be a bunch of XML. We don't want to have to parse XML by hand. So we use this module parser, which will turn it into JSON. So parse string, body, turn it into this result object, which is essentially JSON. The response there will look something like this in XML. We saw that before, TS response, credentials, with my auth token, site ID, etc. So we need these later, just as we did in our curl. We need to save this auth token and save this site ID. So we need to grab our auth token. We do that by going inside the result, inside the TS response element, inside the credentials, inside the attributes for the credentials, grab the token. And similar idea for site ID. Inside of credentials, grab the site and its attribute ID. Cool, we're signed in. We have our auth token, we have our site ID. We're ready to move on. Next step is get all of the workbooks. So we want to grab all the workbooks that have the tag download. We don't need a payload here because it's just a GET request. So we just call GET, and we do that to sites/site ID /workbooks, and that's it. So remember, we queried all of the users. In this case, we're querying all of the workbooks. /site ID /workbooks gives us all the users, workbooks. Now, new in, I believe, Tableau 9.2 or 3, I forget the exact version, is this idea of filtering. Previously, if I wanted to grab all the workbooks with the tag download, I would have had to grab that big XML response payload with every workbook on our site, loop through, and individually check, does this workbook have the tag in the XML that says download? Now I can send the request with this filter object, this filter syntax, inside of the URL, and say, give me all the workbooks filtered to ones that have the download tag. This is useful for a variety of reasons. You might want to say, give me if I'm trying to query a specific user, you can query users filtered to a username, that kind of thing. Okay, and finally, as I said before, every request must have the auth token. In this case, we just throw that in the headers here. The GET request is made, the body is returned, which is a raw response, and it looks something like this. The key parts here are that there is a workbooks element. Inside of that workbooks element, there are many workbook elements, and that's where we need to look inside. So just as before, we parse that body, it turns it into a JSON object, and here's that JSON object result. Our goal here is to get an array of all the XML, all the JSON actually, for all the workbooks. So result.ts response, inside of there, there's the workbooks element, and inside of there is an array containing every workbook element. So we have an array of workbooks. Now we want to grab the images, right? We have to go one step further. We don't want to grab just the images at the workbook level. We want to grab the images for the view level. And you might ask, why couldn't we have just queried all of the views and then got the IDs, etc.? This is kind of the nature of using the REST API. And using REST APIs in general is you have to kind of follow the natural path of the hierarchy. Grab the workbooks. It's not going to tell us any information about the views. So then we have to loop through those workbooks and individually query them to give us detailed information, including the list of views in that workbook. So that's our goal for the next step. Grab an array of view IDs that are in these workbooks. So here's our workbook array that we pass into this getViews function. For each of those, we have this workbook. and we want to grab the ID. Again, you have to actually specify the ID when you're making these queries. Then the object here is sites/site ID/workbooks/workbook ID, and then we go one step further this time and grab all of the views inside of each of those individual workbooks. Here's our old friend, the auth token that we pass in. Take our body, parse it. Here's the result. Each one of these requests, now remember, we're making an individual request for each workbook. I have an array of workbooks. First workbook, query it. Ask Tableau server for each individual view in that workbook. Second workbook, do the same thing. Third workbook, do the same thing. So we want to take all of those views, push them into a single array, and then we can grab the images. So I take that array, tsresponse.views.view, similar to that workbooks.workbook previous array. Take that and push it into an array I'm calling views. Now, because this is Node and there's all this asynchronous nature, you have to do all of this juggling of making sure we're actually done doing all the queries that you wouldn't have to do in, say, Python. But once we're done with querying all of those and pushing all of those views into our view array, now we have our view array and we can grab the individual images. So we have our views array. For each view in that view array, we grab the view ID. So far, this looks pretty similar to the first few lines of code in the last function. For each of those views, we make a request to grab the image for it. Now let me pause here. Say if you go home, you look at the documentation, you won't see this endpoint. This is one example of something that we're working on. It's currently in alpha. Right now, you can grab a preview image for a workbook, but you can't actually download high-res images of views from the REST API. But this is a version I'm running on this laptop. Probably productize it by Q1 or Q2, and then you'll be able to query individual images. Pass in our headers. And then again, I have to do all this kind of file juggling because it's Node. But the important thing here is that I'm creating a new PNG file in a folder called images with the name of that view. When I'm done downloading all those views, I'm trying to download them asynchronously. When I'm done downloading them, now I want to create my PDF. Now essentially we're done with the REST API. So I found this Node module called PDF Kit. It allows me to programmatically create PDFs. I read the directory, the images directory. And for each file in there, I append to the PDF that image. That's done. Then I close the PDF, and that's it. So we wanted to grab the images for every view in a workbook, in workbooks with the tag download. To do that, we had to query the workbooks, filter to workbooks that have the download tag, loop through those workbooks and query all of the views in those workbooks, then loop through those views, and for each of those, download the image, and then sew them all together in the PDF. So we'll get back to some code in a bit, but I bet everyone's ready for a little break from staring at code on a screen. Let's talk a little bit, go into a little bit more details of what can the REST API do. So a lot of times I explain, here's a couple use cases, and people say, so what can it do? Individual endpoints kind of fall into a few items. I like to put them in these 3 categories. Manage users, you saw that. Create, query users. Manage content, such as publishing workbooks, modifying the workbooks with the right tags, or querying workbooks for individual tags. And you can also use it to query, modify, create, all of those little things that kind of organize server. Projects, groups, permissions, make sure the right people have the right access to the right content, can all be automated with the REST API. Now again, you can go to our documentation, REST API documentation, you can just look at the list of endpoints. An easy way to think of this as a rule of thumb is, what can an admin do in the UI of going around Tableau server? They can do all the things we've done. You can add users. You can find out information about users. You can delete workbooks, etc. This isn't 100% foolproof rule of thumb. There are some things that an admin can do in the UI that the REST API can't do, and then there's maybe a couple of things that the REST API can do that an admin can't really do. And I should specify that the REST API is not only for admins. If I log in as an individual user with the REST API, that'll work, but I'll only be able to do things that I could do as that user. If I query the workbooks, I'll only get information about my workbooks I have access to. If I query the users, I'll only get one back. Now, I kind of like that rule of thumb because it kind of hints at what the REST API is not for. Some misconceptions about, hey, I heard Tableau has a REST API, and I think maybe I could use it for X. First is server config. So things you do in start, configure Tableau server, like setting up your authentication mechanism and all this stuff. That's not what the REST API is for. And similarly, things in tab admin. Most of those things you can't do with the REST API. Can't query data inside of a workbook, at least not yet. Going back to my rule of thumb, is that something an admin does in the Tableau server UI? Not really. It's something you do when you open a workbook and you're actually a user using a workbook. So that's kind of more of the domain of the JavaScript API. Now, there's actually a lot of good use cases for querying the data inside workbooks. So that's something we actually want to create in the REST API. We have plans to do that sometime over the next few releases. And finally, people say, oh, Tableau REST API, I have this REST API data source. It's a web service, and it's got a lot of cool data in it. That means I can use that thing to connect to my REST API, right? Nope, that's not what it's for. It's our REST API for managing Tableau server content, not for interacting with other REST APIs. Although there is a feature for that, that's called the Web Data Connector. So you may have noticed, as yeah, so I'll answer quickly, but let's hold, can I hold questions to the end? So querying permissions and that kind of thing, yeah, you can query the list of permissions in Tableau server, or with the REST API. If I couldn't hear it all, so if I didn't get that right, just raise your hand at the end. Okay. So you may have noticed there's a programming language can help me do a lot of the things required for making sure I have the auth token in the right place, the right IDs, managing all of those. But there's still a lot of juggling going on and extra queries I have to make. I have to make sure I have the auth token. I have to kind of craft that XML payload before I send it in. And we want to make that easier. The REST API is great. It's flexible. As I said, it pretty much follows the REST protocol. and you can use any programming language to use it. That's great. It's powerful. It's flexible. But most of the time, you'll want to be doing things with REST APIs in Tableau or otherwise, using some kind of layer on top, some higher level layer. And so we're proud to introduce the Tableau Server Client Library. This is a Python module that implements the REST API. We built it over the summer. We actually hired an intern to do that, and this was his main internship project. Did really well, and as a result, he received an offer to come back to Tableau next summer when he's done with his degree. And the key idea of it is that it handles those things of the REST API that I don't want to handle. It allows me to specify, I want to make this request and not have to worry about too much else. As an example, the first thing Chris, the intern, did when he got to Tableau at the beginning of the summer, took the REST API and he created a sample to publish the workbook. Publishing, you didn't see in any of those examples. There's even more juggling when you have to publish a large file. If it's too large, if it's over, I forget how many megabytes, you have to chunk it into many chunks. Start a session, individually load those chunks. And it's not really the problem with the REST API, that's just the nature of uploading files via HTTP. Nonetheless, it's still a pain. It took him over about 300 lines of code to publish, to create a nice, robust script to publish a workbook. So he spent all summer building the server client library. The last thing he did before going back to school was he recreated that same script to publish a workbook using, this time, his server client library, and it took him less than 20 lines of code. Now, you may not, Python is probably, at this point, one of the most popular scripting languages for this kind of work, but not every programming environment can make use of Python. If your web application is in .NET, you don't want to shell out to a Python script, stuff like that. So that's where we're starting, and we're going to move on from there. We'll start to add just based on people will raise their hand and say, we need a module for Java, we need a module for C#, we need a module for JavaScript, and we'll start to build those. Last night at Devs on Stage, if you were there, Ben, the guy who's throwing shirts all around, he revealed the JavaScript version of the REST API. It's still in alpha, but should be done with it relatively soon. Finally, all of these will be open sourced on GitHub. That means if you have a specific use case, you think something should be augmented, a way that we can handle some of the difficult parts of the REST API differently, clone the repository, modify it, and submit a pull request. And we will manage this as if it's as an open source project. This and the other client libraries to come. Okay, so let me check the time here. Let's hop back into code here and actually show you an example of a REST API, a server client library script. Now I have to set up the scenario first. This instance of Tableau Server is multi-tenant. We have people who work for Coke on this instance, and we have people who work for Pepsi. And in general, we don't want the content to seep through. That's why we're using sites. It's a nice firewall between things. But occasionally, there might be cases where me as the Tableau Server administrator or the workbook creator, I want to create a workbook once and have it on all of my sites. So I have this share project, And the goal of this script is maybe once a day or maybe every hour. Check if there are any new any new workbooks in this share project, and if so, move them over to the Pepsi site. So, oops. Python, migrate workbooks. That'll run. Oh yeah, this is a good point to take a question or two. This will take a few minutes, so just a question or two. Yep.
So you mentioned that the REST API is not for querying data to workbook, but with Tableau, and I've been reading about get data, get columns, to read the bills and get the data out.
Yeah, let me make sure I understand. So I said there is no, the REST API cannot query data inside a workbook, but there is a function called get data that allows you to read individual rows and columns from a workbook. That's via the JavaScript API. And so that's kind of why I wanted to specify. If you were able to grab an individual workbook with the REST API, you couldn't then just easily grab the data. You would have to load it using the JavaScript API to get the data inside. Like I said, that's a scenario we want to enable for a variety of reasons. Okay, so I'll answer more questions here at the end. The migrate workbooks is done. Let's go back to our Pepsi share site. I don't know if I actually pointed out there weren't any projects in there, and now they're all there. So what do we do here? First of all, I'll point out this is 28 lines of code. It's doing a lot more behind the scenes than my grab images JS file, which was 118 lines of code. That's partially due to the power succinctness of Python, and a lot due to the power of the server client library. So first thing you do with the REST API is you sign in. And you'll notice you're using the server client library in a similar way. It's just every step is a lot easier to do. When I want to sign in with the REST API, I craft this XML payload, specify the content URL, etc. With the server client library, I create a Tableau auth object, pass in my credentials and the site I want to log into, specify what server I want to log into, and then sign into it. Not only is that only 3 lines of code, but I never have to think about the auth token for the rest of the script. The server client library will just persist it inside of this server object and insert it as the header for every further request. Next thing I want to do is query all of the workbooks with the project name, query all of the workbooks that are in the project share. And that's this line. Single line of code, and I think really highlights the power of the server client library. So give me a second here. Here's that line of code. What are we doing? There's a lot going on in this single line. So what are we doing here? First of all, we're calling the server.getWorkbooks. Sometimes that might return multiple pages. That's part of the REST API. If you have hundreds or thousands of objects, you don't want to return those all in a single request. So we paginate. However, that is kind of a pain to send a request, then figure out you need to send the request to page 2, then to page 3, etc. So this Tableau server client.pager just does it for us and returns an array of all of the workbooks, even though it's handling the multiple requests required. Take all those workbooks, call them WB, and for each of those, we'll filter if wb.project name equals share. Now, what would happen if I actually was doing this from the REST API? What all is going on from this one line of code? First of all, I'm querying the workbooks for the site. I'm paginating and sending a different request for each page. I'm parsing the XML. I'm looping through the XML of each workbook. I'm checking the ID attribute in the individual project, all of the individual project attributes. And then I'm pushing if they match the project name, project ID, which I would have to have stored already, pushing those to an array. But instead, I do that with a single line of code of the Tableau Server client library. So now I have all my list of workbooks. Sign into my Pepsi server. I need to find the share project on the Pepsi server. It's a separate project. So similarly, I call Pepsi server.projects.get. This is a similar line of code that we just saw where I'm basically filtering that workbook to the project that is the share project. And then for each of my workbooks, I download them from the Coke server, place them into a temp directory, then I create a new workbook object in the Tableau server client. This will contain the metadata about the workbook, including what project I want it to go to. That's all I need to do to call Pepsi server.workbooks.publish and pass in, for each of those workbooks, pass in the workbook, and it'll be published. Again, I don't have to handle any of that chunking, making sure I start a session, checking on the session, throwing all those chunks up on the Tableau server. It's just a few lines of code. And then when I'm done with that, I delete my temp directory, and all of the workbooks have been migrated to the other share project. That's it. Hopefully you see the value of the server client library, how much headaches it'll solve. We really want people to go start using this, give us feedback on its usability, but also does it handle all of your use cases as well. You can either just send feedback to us, or again, clone it, make some modifications, submit a pull request. So that's pretty much all I got. Just going to give you if you haven't seen this before, really good resource. If you have NPM or pip installed, install this. These are the things you saw on Ben's shirts last night. Developers.tableau.com is a really good resource. One-stop shop for all things related to the Tableau developer platform, including documentation, forums, etc. And all of our open source projects are on GitHub at github/Tableau. Finally, we have a lot of training. Some is on our website, but a lot of it is on YouTube. Just click on the search box, search for #datadev. Sorry, people are taking a picture of that slide, so I'll wait for a second. And I'll start taking questions. Yeah, I saw his first.
Did you just get lucky that your data source wasn't still in code in all of your workbooks, or how would you deal with that?
Did I get lucky, or did I engineer it that way? Yeah, so the question is, essentially, how would I manage the data sources from, my data source was it in Pepsi and Coke, that kind of thing. Yeah, so a lot of times when you do this kind of migration, and there's a lot more use cases for that kind of migration, you might want to modify things about the data source. And one way you can do that is if it's just a changing of an address of a data source, then you can do that with the REST API. You can modify data sources. However, if you need to change something like the DB name or pointing at a completely different one, you would need to use the document API. So what you do is you pull those workbooks down. Document API is essentially a way we can modify XML, modify all those, and then push them up. So that would be a typical migration script. In this case, it was just a single. Those were probably like Excel workbooks. But if both had access to the same database, then that wouldn't be a problem. But if you do have that issue, you have to. Of course, you have some extra work to do. I saw. I'll go with him. Sorry. Yeah. If you saw devs on stage, what Ben did was a migration that's a lot more robust than the one I showed, and it includes using the document API. And yeah, that will be on the it'll be in the TC16 utilities and also on GitHub, on the GitHub. Sorry, does hand go down? Oh, sorry, here it is.
You mentioned that you can change the workbooks using the REST API. What part of the workbook can you
The metadata, like the name of it, the tags, stuff like that.
directly, nothing inside the
Correct. Yeah. That's what the document API is for. Right now, you can just change the address. So I saw this one next, sorry.
If your company is not on a standard fiscal year, Tableau allows you to set custom year the data source. So is there a way to send a request when you publish on the data source and set fiscal year?
I don't think so. The question is, can you set the fiscal year of a data source using the REST API when you publish or modify an existing data source? Fairly certain the answer to that is no. You'd have to do that kind of in Tableau Desktop where you do that otherwise. Is the server client library a native library or is it a wrapper? Yeah, so sorry, I should have specified that. Server client library is essentially a wrapper around the REST API. And all of the server client libraries, right now we have the server client library Python and we'll start releasing them. They will be wrappers around the REST API. So I'll come to you next. Right over there. Right there.
Yeah. Before you download a workbook, like an image of a workbook, can you affect filters on it or select,
You can do that if you just make a direct GET request to a workbook URL, not with the REST API. The question is, so I grabbed those images. Could I filter while I did that? So that's a good question. I don't think you can do that with this endpoint. You could do that by making a GET request directly to that URL, passing in the filter and appending with .png or whatever. That requires you to authenticate not using the REST API, though, in some other way. But that is something that I think there's a pretty good use case for that. So like I said, that's an alpha endpoint. It's on two people's machines at this point. So I'll go talk to that developer and say, yeah, that's a good idea. Here.
Yeah, so when you authenticate as an admin, I was thinking about the same thing you kind of just asked. If you have row-level security for different users, because if you have to generate a PDF report for hundreds of sales managers, could you then log in as that user, subsets the data, take the image, and email that to that person?
Good question. So the question is, I downloaded those images. Are they going to somehow respect row-level security, or can I specify I want to grab an image for a user, that kind of thing? The way we do that with preview image is that you can just specify one user to generate the preview image for, and then if you downloaded it with the REST API, it would grab that one. So you wouldn't be able to specify which user you're logging into at that moment. And I assume it's the same thing for this, but there might be thoughts on how do we handle row-level security. I don't know. I haven't been in that conversation.
When you're the admin, you can select
Right.
the user you want to view, and it subsets the data.
Yeah. Again, something that's totally reasonable, and I can think of a lot of good use cases for that. But I don't think it's an endpoint now. It's something we might work on. Yeah. There's one over here. Sorry.
Is there anything server-side for debugging? So you make a call and it's not returning what you want. Is there any logging?
The question is there any logging that helps you debug some of these requests? First of all, the response will give you some details, like 401, 403, bad XML, or something like that. Those kind of responses are slightly vague, but they should be in the log files. And I forget which log files, because I always forget what's in which log file, but any request to Tableau server should be in the log somewhere. Exactly where for the REST API, I don't know off the top of my head. So take a couple more. I got to start getting ready for my next session. Yeah, right here.
Does the server protect at all against a replay attack, or are you assuming that HTTPS is going to prevent somebody from capturing that off code on rolling?
What kind of attack?
somebody can replay that off code, right? Because it never changes.
Um,
In all your examples, you're just using HTTP. I'm assuming that you would configure a live server with HTTPS.
yes, so you can configure server with HTTPS, yep.
And there's no other protection. The server doesn't validate.
I didn't sign out in my scripts for brevity, but you would sign out and then that authentication token would be invalidated. That's another thing that would secure against that. Sorry, we'll go here and then that's the last one I can take, I'm sorry.
So most of the time you show us how to build these REST APIs.
Mm-hmm.
Where this code gets executed, is this through the
Where does it get executed?
yeah, how do you execute it?
Oh, well, the examples I gave are kind of some of these automation types of examples. The question is, how do you execute these types of REST API things? Wherever you need that automation. If I'm kind of an IT type of user and I just need some Python scripts that I want to be able to type on my command line, it would be just like this, right? I might have that add users.py that I can run whenever I want. Yeah. Exactly. But yeah. So that user would have that Python script on their machine. So it's wherever that code is generating is where it would be. So if I had another web application that wants to do things to Tableau server, those scripts would probably be, or that would be part of the application that would kick off those processes. You can't bypass the security because you have to log in. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, individual users can do with the REST API what they're allowed to do in the UI. Yeah. But not other things.